Hey everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Slay with Zay, and I am your trans tutor. On this episode, we're going to be discussing the gender binary and the gender spectrum, as well as transgender as an umbrella term and the various gender identities that come underneath that umbrella, and the pronouns that go with those gender identities. Now, I know I kind of just said a mouthful and that may have confused you a little bit, but don't be alarmed. I'm here to help. Just make sure you're listening, paying attention, and get involved. Ask me some questions in the comments underneath this video. Let's figure out what these things are together so we can have a better understanding of improving our world. So, let's get into it, talking about gender expansive people, the binary, and transgender as a lot more. Remember, 101, we're not going to go too crazy, but we're going to provide you with information. So, let's begin. Okay, so let's begin with an idea we're already knowledgeable about, and that is the gender spectrum. And so on the gender spectrum, we learned that people have various identities, but the ones we've been dealing with exclusively have been about man and woman, the ones at the ends. There are people in the middle, which we're going to discuss in a moment, but we've been exclusively working with people who are men, so cisgender men or transgender men. And on the opposite side, we've been working with trans women and cisgender women. Now, underneath the transgender umbrella, there are other people outside of these two extremes. So some people transition and they move away from their original biological sex gender they were assigned, and they move to one that's more comfortable. They may not make it all the way to the other side because that's not what they want, that's not what they desire, that's not who they are. So they only make it to a certain point. The other way might also be true. If you move from this way to this way, it is also feasible. Everyone gets to decide their own gender and how they wish to interact with the world. So, this idea is called being non-binary, which means non-binary is the opposite of binary. We've been working exclusively with the binary system. Binary, of course, means two. There's two of something, like a bicycle or a bisexual person. Bi, of course, means two. So, someone who is underneath the non-binary umbrella, underneath the trans umbrella, basically means that their gender did not go from one extreme to the other. Their gender is somewhere in the middle, or it's not on the gender spectrum at all, which is also very feasible. Now, let's get a little bit more in depth in the next section, okay? Let's go. In the last section, I briefly covered the idea of binary versus non-binary, so let's get a little bit more in depth into that. So, the idea that binary exists is just not pertaining strictly to gender. It happens in our everyday life. Binaries like left or right or up or down, stop and go, yes and no. Sometimes there is a middle area to these things. We know that to be true. We call it the gray area. It's a little bit of wiggle room, because sometimes people say yes and no, but sometimes it's a maybe, sometimes it's a sort of, maybe it's a kind of, or an I don't know. It depends on the situation. So, gender isn't limited to this idea either. So not everyone's going to choose man and not everyone's going to choose woman, because that's not what pertains to them. People have the ability to choose their own gender. Again, nothing to do with biological sex. They get to choose their own gender. So, with that being said, some people may fall in the middle of this section outside of the binary system, and they are considered non-binary. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to present like androgynous, like a man or woman crossbreed or whatever your brain configurates or whatever. People are going to have a different view of how they want themselves to be perceived and dress accordingly. Make sense? Because your gender expression and your gender correlates, but sometimes it doesn't correlate. And these people are traditionally in the non-binary section. Not always, but probably more than likely. Now, I know that seems a little bit confusing, but everyone gets to make their own decision about how they wish to interact with the world. There is a gray area. It exists. We should allow people to expand and grow and be in that area. Now, Non-binary and binary are both underneath the transgender umbrella. As we just said a little while ago, you can have a trans man and a trans woman. You can also have trans non-binary people. Okay? So let's get into some of the gender identities that fall underneath trans non-binary category. Okay, so we just talked about non-binary people just a little bit, but let's dive a little bit more into the various identities that are underneath the trans non-binary category. So most of these people are going to present in various different ways. There's no set in stone way for these people to present to the world. We have high expectations because we live in a binary system that they will make a decision, that they will choose, but they have chosen. They've chosen the gray area in the non-binary section that works the best for them. So what we have to do is be mindful and respectful of those people and how they wish to present to the world. So they can come in all various shapes, sizes, colors, creeds, everything. So be mindful and be ready for that. There are also gender non-conforming people. And I think that one's a little bit self-explanatory. Their gender is not conforming to the idea of the binary. Similar to non-binary, but labels are labels. Use what they tell you. It's appropriate. You don't want someone to mislabel you or misgender you or treat you differently, so don't do that. So, gender non-conforming people may be born male and may be assigned man at birth, but then their gender may shift and move. They may wear makeup, they may wear dresses and things like that, things associated with womanhood. And the opposite may happen if they're born female and they're assigned to be a girl, but then their gender is non-conforming, so they may cut their hair short like a boy's buzz cut, or they may wear Timbs or man suits or men's suits. It doesn't matter. So those are gender non-conforming people. We also have gender queer people. So gender queer people, again, will have to tell you how they identify specifically. If gender queer is their label, that's their label. Gender queer basically means that their gender is queer. And we know that queer means ambiguous or strange, or it could change. So their gender can change or it could fluctuate or things like that. So you have to, again, be mindful. They won't present in a specific kind of way. And then we'll also cover gender fluid. And you guessed it, their gender is fluid. And fluid along the binary spectrum, where they can present as more masculine or they can present more feminine. So let's talk a little bit about ones that are a little bit more ambiguous than these. Okay, let's go. Okay, so we talked about transgender non-binary, gender queer people, gender non-conforming people, and gender fluid people. Now, the reason I wanted to kind of separate those few is because the ones we're going to talk about now are going to be off of the gender spectrum in totality, whereas the last one we just talked about were kind of on the spectrum. They kind of moved and kind of bounced back and forth in this realm, in this idea. But there are non-binary trans people who are going to identify as Neutrois or as agender. These are relatively the same gender identities, but there are little nuances that we can research deeper, but I just want to bring them to your attention. Agender and Neutrois. So this basically says this person is genderless. Do not give them a gender identity. This is what they believe themselves to be, and this is how they identify with the world and how they wish to interact with the world. Again, they have a biological sex. That is not gone. Their gender is not on the spectrum. It's non-existent. They don't believe in it. And they don't have to, because gray area, not on it at all. You know, there's spaces outside for various people. So allow them to express themselves and be in that way. Now that could be a little confusing or strange, like make up your mind and choose. This is also confusing. But we have to allow people to be. Okay? Even people within the transgender community who are binary like myself could say, that's weird, that's strange, but we can't do that. We have to allow people to express and be how they are. So, agender or Neutrois is a genderless gender. And I think it sounds funny sometimes to say things like that, but it's true and it's real and it's valid, most importantly. It can be a little bit humorous to think about someone without a gender, but this is how they interact with the world. This is how they wish to be perceived and all those things. Just as I want to be perceived and you want to be perceived correctly. Agender and Neutrois are a little bit more ambiguous. They are not on the gender spectrum. They are somewhere out in the nebulous, the gray space. Okay? So let's go on to pronouns now. All right? Let's go. Now, typically you can't assume someone's gender from first glance. You don't want to assume things like that. Because, you know, when you assume, you make, that. So don't assume anyone's gender. I know it can be kind of rough trying to be like, how do I do this? Here's how. When you introduce yourself to someone and you're uncertain what their gender is, and you should kind of do this with everybody just to play it safe, you can say, hi, my name is so-and-so and my pronouns are, and you say what your pronouns are. So, for example, I would say, hi, my name is Zayday and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. See, that opens the door and lets people know that they can have a conversation with you about their gender experience, and they'll be able to tell you what their pronouns are so you can respect them accordingly. You never want to assume. Do not assume. Don't think that you know better. You do not know them. They know themselves much better, I assure you. So, let's talk about the pronouns a little bit more in depth. Here we go. Now we can discuss pronouns in great depth. So let's talk about the gender spectrum, the gender binary once more. So on the binary, we have man and we have woman. And so of course we're gonna have pronouns that correlate with that. So typically when you see someone who appears to be a man or masculine, if you don't know their name, you're going to use a pronoun in lieu of their actual name. Or if you do know their name and you don't want to say their name, which is very long, or something like that, you will say a pronoun instead. So, for example, if this was a trans masculine person or a cisgendered man, you would say he, him, and his as far as his pronouns are concerned. Okay? Now, if it was the opposite, then you would see someone who appears a feminine or a woman, you would say she, her, and hers. Okay? Now, those are the binary gender pronouns we're most knowledgeable about. And so we typically use those. We also use the new, very, very newly used, even though we've been using it forever in the queer community, the gender neutral terms of they, them, and theirs. Okay? So that can be used for someone who is on the binary, off the binary, because, you know, you can say, hey, give me that, that's theirs. And they could be referring to me. It doesn't offend me. Theirs or they or them is also a gender neutral one. So it's kind of the middle gray area that people who are non-binary, underneath the non-binary umbrella, they may use those pronouns to ensure that they don't get misgendered. Okay? So you may say, like, that's weird, that's strange, it's usually possessive, but I just used it on myself and I'm a singular person. So people's pronouns can be they, them, or theirs. Okay? Now, a more new aged one that most people are not familiar with that's also gender neutral is Z, Zir, and Zir. So, I know, that one's a little bit strange, and it's not used very frequently. That's because it doesn't have the growing popularity. But within advanced queer communities, we have been using it for quite some time. And so it's another gender neutral one that people may use. And in addition to that, some people may use more than one of these. Some people may use he and she and their and them and zir all at the same time. You know, for example, I know that drag queens, particularly when they're in drag, they will use he, they will use she, they will use they. It doesn't matter. So you will just have to ask someone what their pronouns are. And I just demonstrated how to do that just in the last section. So give it a try with someone you know to see how it goes. All right, we have come to the end of another episode. So on this episode, we discuss the gender spectrum, the gender binary, various gender identities underneath the transgender umbrella, and pronouns. Okay, so this may need a couple of times to watch this video and maybe doing some independent research for you to figure out exactly how you want people to perceive yourself or how you perceive other people. So it's gonna be up to you to do a little bit more research. I can give you a little bit, but you have to make sure you do it on your own and apply what you know, okay? So let's go ahead and wrap this episode on up. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you like the content, please like it, share it, retweet it, whatever you have to do. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and you can subscribe on YouTube and use the hashtag #SlayWithZay in order for me to see the conversation, and we can continue the conversation even further so we can understand things at a greater level. So again, thank you so much for joining me, and this has been another lovely episode of Slay with Zay.